Okay, so an important, sort of cortical landmark that separates the more anterior or rostral frontal lobe from the more posterior, caudal parietal lobe right here, is this what we call central sulcus. So this is following my finger. Let's see if I can do this here. Following my finger all the way down to here, basically. Usually, it's interesting. The central sulcus doesn't tend to go all the way down to the lateral fissure, but it sort of goes around like this. But the gyrus that is just before, in the, rostral direction, just before that central sulcus there, that central valley, separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, that particular gyrus is called the precentral gyrus. It's before you get to the central sulcus. And along that precentral gyrus actually is a map of the opposite side of the body in terms of efferent or motor output. So if we're looking at it like this, oh, sorry, I should do it the right way. Actually, no, I was doing it right. Like this right here. Here is the precentral gyrus right here. Arrayed along that, gyrus, it turns out if you stimulate different portions of it, you'll get the opposite side of the body, different portions of the opposite side of the body to move. And there's a famous neurologist or neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield who did a great deal of surgeries on individuals who were, suffering from epilepsy. It was intractable epilepsy that couldn't be very well controlled with drugs. He was at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and he would, as sort of a last resort, actually, remove, the scalp, the skull, cut through the meninges, and look for areas of the brain that have been damaged by epileptic seizures. And there are, for example, areas with repeated seizure activity that look epileptiform. They're visible as something that should be removed. But areas that are around it, it's not always clear that they are, damaged. They look like, normal cortical tissue. However, they may be the source of these, continuing seizures. So Penfield would actually take an electrode and, place it on a portion of that cortex and then stimulate. And then, he'd often have, people saying things or, trying to do things. This is all during surgery. They're awake, answering questions, etc. And then he would note the response. Like, did that do something in some way to their perception or their cognition or their behavior? And then he would actually, have a little notebook. He would place a little number on that portion of cortex, and then right next to it, like, this interrupted speech, or this, provoked a memory, or there was a strong smell associated, or nothing. The patient reported nothing at all. And those are the areas that he was felt a little safer about removing, during these surgeries. So he actually, made it very clear that there is this remarkable mapping of motor output along the precentral gyrus. So this is in the frontal lobe, right? This is the last gyrus in the frontal lobe before you hit the central sulcus right here. And mapped out along here, if you stimulated portions of that, you get this finger to move, then this finger to move, then this finger to move. It would move the opposite side of the body in a consistent fashion. So there was a mapping, basically, of this half of the body in terms of motor output on the precentral gyrus on the opposite or contralateral hemisphere of the brain. This map, however, he noted, was an odd map. It is not a one-to-one mapping, and there were odd discontinuities, like all of a sudden you go from your hand to your face, and things like that. So actually, I've got some images here that show you this mapping and the little figure that has been created, based upon how the cortex maps, the opposite side of the body. It's called the homunculus, the little person. And it's actually really interesting because it exaggerates rather dramatically the hands and the face and the larynx and the pharynx and the tongue, right? And it sort of makes, has less representation, less map space, for movement of the torso and the legs. So it really is a mapping based on, fine motor control. You have a lot more mapped regions basically in that precentral gyrus, for efferent and motor output to the fingers and the larynx and the pharynx and the face, because you can, make more, significant changes in how, those parts of your body are actually arrayed. If you go over in a caudal direction, right, or a posterior direction from the precentral gyrus, let me find it again here. This sort of precentral gyrus here, right? The precentral gyrus right along here. Go over the central sulcus. Now you're in the post-central gyrus. Now you're in the parietal lobe. Remember, the parietal lobe is really critically important for spatially mapping, the location of your body and its position in, spatial relations to other objects and events that are around you. Well, that post-central gyrus has an analogous homuncular map, like a map that sort of exaggerates the hands, exaggerates the face, exaggerates the tongue and the larynx and pharynx, and has much more diminished, space devoted to, the torso and the legs and things like that. But in terms of sensory, somatosensory, sensation from the body, from the opposite side of the body, mapped along that post-central gyrus in the parietal lobe. And it's interesting because, again, it reflects the fine sort of discriminative capacity of certain portions of the contralateral or other half of the body, right? Like your fingertips, if you really want to know what something is, you put your hand in your pocket and see which key you've got or what coin you've got. You don't put your elbow in because you don't have the same discriminative capacity. There's not as much mapping here. There aren't many sensory, receptors out, in your elbow as there are, for example, in the tips of your fingers. So that's reflected also in greater distribution of cortex devoted to, sensory information, derived from the fingertips, for example, than, from the elbow. So the homunculus it's a really interesting organization for all cortex. So we're going to see that in other, let's say, primary sensory cortices, like in auditory cortex, you're going to have, for example, a range of frequencies of sound waves that we can detect. However, we don't detect all those, ranges equally. So we have far more, cortex in primary auditory cortex, which is located in the temporal lobe, right down here, in through this lateral, fissure along the planum temporale, a gyrus called Heschel's gyrus in there. But we have a lot more cortex there devoted to the processing of, frequencies with, like 300 to 5,000 hertz, for example, cycles per second, than we do for the very high frequency mosquito sounds. And that's because we're very good at, discriminating the various sounds and frequencies that are associated with human speech, right? So we can actually, tell something and convey information and, perceive information, within ranges that are, actually, behaviorally relevant to us. So the homuncular organization is rather a critical, principle of, cortical organization. We don't have, the same one-to-one mapping, for example, of every part of the body in terms of efferent and afferent output and input.